The bullet grazed past Victoria Oakes's cheek so close she felt the heat of it. And in that moment of suspended terror, when she thought her wild ride through the Dakota Territory would end in blood and dust, a horseman appeared from nowhere, moving like smoke across the prairie. And though his lips never parted above a whisper, his presence alone made 3 armed bandits turn their horses and flee into the failing light of 1876. Victoria's heart hammered against her ribs as she struggled to control her spooked mare, the reins cutting into her palms. She had been riding hard from Deadwood, carrying the deed to her father's mining claim after his death 3 weeks prior, when the men had spotted her lone figure against the vast South Dakota landscape. The horseman who had saved her sat motionless on a paint stallion, watching her with eyes the color of storm clouds. He was young, perhaps 25 to her 22 years, with dark hair that touched his shoulders and a face that might have been carved from the same stone as the black hills rising in the distance. "Thank you," Victoria gasped, finally bringing her mare under control. "They would have killed me for certain." The man inclined his head slightly, but said nothing. His silence unnerved her almost as much as the attack had. Most men she encountered talked endlessly, boasting and posturing, but this one simply sat his horse with a stillness that seemed almost preternatural. "I am Victoria Oakes," she tried again, moving her horse closer to his. "I am heading to lead. My father had a claim there before he passed." The horseman's expression softened almost imperceptibly. He gestured ahead, down the trail that wound through the pine-covered hills, then touched his chest lightly. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet she had to lean forward to hear it, barely more than a breath on the wind. "Jacob Emmett. I will see you safe." Those whispered words carried more weight than any shouted promise. Victoria felt something shift in her chest, a curious mixture of relief and something else she could not quite name. She nodded, and together they rode as the sun painted the sky in shades of copper and gold. The trail to lead took them through country so beautiful it made Victoria's throat ache. She had been raised in St. Louis, in a world of cobblestones and gas lamps, but her father had filled her childhood with stories of the West, of mountains that touched the sky and rivers that ran silver with fortune. When he had left 5 years ago to seek his future in the Black Hills, she had been 17 and heartbroken. Now she was returning to claim what was left of his dreams, a small mining operation that might be worthless or might be her salvation. Jacob Emmett rode slightly ahead, his body moving with his horse as though they were one creature. He never looked back to check if she followed, yet somehow she knew he was aware of her every movement. When her mare stumbled over a root, he slowed. When she needed to rest, he found a clear spring before she had to ask. His silence was not empty or cold. It was simply his nature, as much a part of him as the way he sat his horse or the careful way he scanned the horizon. As twilight deepened into true darkness, Jacob led them to a sheltered spot beneath an overhang of rock. He dismounted in one fluid motion and began gathering wood for a fire. Victoria climbed down from her mare with considerably less grace, her legs trembling from hours in the saddle. She had thought herself a decent rider back in St. Louis, but this day had proven how little she truly knew about the demands of the frontier. "Let me help," she said, moving to unsaddle her horse. Jacob glanced at her, and for the first time she saw something like approval in his eyes. He nodded and continued his work. They moved around each other in a silence that felt strangely comfortable, establishing camp with an efficiency that surprised Victoria. She had expected to feel afraid, alone in the wilderness with a man she did not know, but instead she felt safer than she had in weeks. When the fire was crackling and the horses were settled, Jacob produced a small pot and some supplies from his saddlebags. He set about making coffee and heating beans with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. Victoria watched him, fascinated by his economy of movement, the way he wasted no gesture or word. "Why do you speak so quietly?" she asked, then immediately regretted the question. It seemed too personal, too intrusive. Jacob looked at her across the fire, his face half in shadow. When he spoke, she had to still her own breathing to hear him. Learned young that loud voices bring trouble. Quiet ones make people listen. There was a story there, layers of meaning in those whispered words, but Victoria sensed now was not the time to press. Instead, she accepted the tin cup of coffee he handed her, their fingers brushing for just a moment. The contact sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with the cold night air. "Those men who chased me," she said. "Do you think they will come back?" Jacob shook his head slightly. "They know this territory, know me. They will not come back. You have a fearsome reputation then," the corner of his mouth lifted in what might have been a smile. "Some say." Victoria sipped her coffee, studying him over the rim of her cup. Jacob Emmett was unlike any man she had ever encountered. He carried himself with a quiet confidence that needed no reinforcement from swagger or boasting. His gun sat easy in its holster, well used but not ostentatious. Everything about him spoke of capability and strength held in reserve. "I am grateful you came along when you did," she said softly. "I was foolish to ride alone. My father's lawyer in Deadwood warned me, but I thought I could manage the distance before nightfall." "You ride well enough," Jacob whispered, "but this country does not forgive mistakes." "Where were you heading when you found me, Lead? I have business there." Victoria's eyebrows rose. "What sort of business?" Jacob was quiet for a long moment, gazing into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was even softer than usual, and she had to lean closer to catch the words. "I scout for the mining companies, track ore deposits, map the hills, some other work when it is needed." "Other work," he met her eyes directly. "The kind that keeps settlements safe, the kind that does not always stay inside the law." Victoria should have been alarmed by this admission, but instead she found herself intrigued. The West was not St. Louis. Out here, survival often required bending rules that seemed arbitrary when measured against the vastness of the land and the dangers it held. "I see," she said quietly. "And do you enjoy this work?" Jacob considered the question with the same serious attention he seemed to give everything. "It suits me. I prefer the hills to towns, horses to people, the silence up here." He gestured vaguely at the darkness surrounding their small circle of firelight. "The silence," Victoria repeated. "Yes, I am beginning to understand the appeal." They talked little more that night, but the silence between them felt rich with possibility. Victoria wrapped herself in her bedroll on one side of the fire while Jacob took the other, his rifle within easy reach. She should have felt vulnerable, but instead she felt protected, watched over by someone who took his responsibilities seriously. She woke once in the deep part of the night to find Jacob sitting up, his eyes scanning the darkness. The fire had burned down to embers, casting barely enough light to see his profile. He seemed carved from shadow himself, a guardian between her and the wild darkness beyond. Victoria closed her eyes again and slept more soundly than she had since her father's death. Morning came cold and clear, the sun painting the pine trees gold. Jacob already had coffee brewing by the time Victoria emerged from her bedroll, and he handed her a cup without a word. They ate a simple breakfast of hardtack and dried meat, then broke camp with the same efficient partnership they had established the night before. The trail to Lead grew steeper as they rode, climbing into the Black Hills proper. Victoria had never seen country like this, the pine forests dense and fragrant, the hills rising in waves of green and gray. Occasionally they would pass other travelers, miners heading to their claims or freight wagons loaded with supplies. Each time, Jacob would nod silently in greeting, and Victoria noticed how the other men's eyes would widen slightly in recognition. Whatever reputation Jacob Emmett had earned, it commanded respect. "How long have you lived in the Black Hills?" Victoria asked as they followed a particularly narrow section of trail, riding single file. 4 years, Jacob answered, his voice barely carrying back to her. "Came after the gold rush started. Figured there was more money in helping miners find their fortunes than in chasing my own." "That seems very practical." "I am a practical man." Victoria smiled at that. "What brought you west in the first place?" Jacob was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his words were so quiet she almost missed them. "Nothing left for me back east. War took my family. Farm was gone. Seemed like the frontier might offer a new start." The war between the states had ended 11 years ago, but its scars still marked the nation. Victoria's own family had been divided by it. Uncles fighting uncles, cousins turned strangers. She understood the desire to leave all that pain behind and seek something new in the unsettled territories. "I am sorry for your loss," she said gently. Jacob turned in his saddle to look back at her, and for just a moment his expression was unguarded, showing depths of old pain that made her heart constrict. "Long time ago now," he whispered. "This land has a way of healing old wounds." They rode in silence for a while after that, but it felt different now, weighted with shared understanding. Victoria found herself watching the way Jacob moved, the confident set of his shoulders, the gentle way he handled his horse. There was something deeply appealing about his quiet strength, his lack of pretense. In St. Louis, men had courted her with flowers and poetry, with elaborate declarations and empty promises. Jacob Emmett offered none of that. Yet somehow his presence felt more substantial than all those pretty words combined. By midday they could see Lead in the valley below, a collection of rough buildings and mine entrances scattered across the hillsides. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, and the distant sound of hammering and shouting drifted up to them. It was smaller than Victoria had imagined, more raw and temporary looking, as though a strong wind might sweep it all away. "That is it?" she asked, unable to keep the disappointment from her voice. "It grows fast," Jacob said. 2 years ago there was nothing here. Now there are hundreds of claims being worked. The Homestake mine is the biggest operation in the territory." Victoria squared her shoulders. She had not come all this way to be discouraged by rough appearances. Her father had believed there was something valuable in these hills, and she owed it to his memory to find out if he had been right. "Where was your father's claim?" Jacob asked as they began the descent into town. "Somewhere called Strawberry Gulch. The lawyer said it is about a mile northeast of the main settlement." Jacob nodded. "I know it. Small operation, but the geology there is promising. Your father was not chasing fool's gold." Something in Victoria's chest loosened at these words. She had been terrified that she would arrive to find her father had wasted his last years on a worthless dream. "Did you know him?" "My father, Daniel Oakes. Met him a few times. Quiet man, kept to himself mostly. Serious about his work. He hired me once to map the mineral veins on his property." Victoria blinked back sudden tears. Hearing someone speak of her father in the present tense of memory rather than the distant past of loss made him feel close again, real and solid. "What was he like? Here, I mean." "In his letters he always seemed so hopeful, but I wondered if that was just what he wanted me to believe." Jacob was quiet for a moment, clearly choosing his words with care. "He was lonely, I think. Missed you. He talked about you sometimes, said you had your mother's fire and his stubbornness. But he was doing good work. He was happy in his way. They had reached the outskirts of Lead now, passing the first scattered buildings. Men stopped to stare at Victoria, and she felt suddenly conscious of how she must look after days of travel, her riding dress dusty and her hair escaping from its pins. Jacob moved his horse closer to hers, a subtle but unmistakable statement of protection. The staring men quickly found other places to look. "I need to report to the marshal's office," Jacob said quietly. "Then I can take you to your father's claim if you would like. I would appreciate that very much." The marshal's office was a sturdy log building near the center of town. Jacob dismounted and gestured for Victoria to wait. He disappeared inside for only a few minutes, and when he emerged, another man was with him. This man was older, perhaps 50, with a silver star pinned to his vest and sharp eyes that took in everything. "Miss Oakes," the marshal said, touching the brim of his hat. "I am Marshal Thomas Hendricks. I am sorry for the loss of your father. He was a good man." "Thank you," Victoria managed, her throat tight. "Jacob here tells me you were attacked on the trail from Deadwood. Can you describe the men?" Victoria did her best to recall the details, but in truth the attack had happened so fast, and she had been so frightened that she remembered little beyond the terror. Jacob stood silent beside the marshal, but his presence was comforting, solid and real. "Sounds like the Saunders gang," Marshal Hendricks said grimly. "They have been harassing lone travelers for weeks now. We will catch up with them eventually. In the meantime, Miss Oakes, I would advise you not to travel alone. Lead is not St. Louis." "I am learning that," Victoria said. The marshal turned to Jacob. "I trust you will see Miss Oakes safely settled." It was not really a question. Jacob nodded once, and Victoria saw something pass between the two men, some understanding that went beyond words. After leaving the marshal's office, Jacob led Victoria to the general store, where she purchased basic supplies for the claim. The storekeeper, a round woman named Mrs. Brennan, clucked sympathetically over Victoria's situation and promised to extend credit until the mine started producing. "Your father was always good for his debts," Mrs. Brennan said. "I reckon you are the same, and having Jacob Emmett vouch for you does not hurt either." Victoria glanced at Jacob, who had said nothing about vouching for her, but he merely gave her that almost smile and carried her purchases out to the horses. The ride to Strawberry Gulch took them away from the main settlement, following a rough track that climbed steadily into the hills. Victoria's heart began to beat faster as they approached. This was her father's claim, the place where he had spent his last years, the dream he had chased across half a continent. The claim itself was modest but neat. There was a small cabin built of rough-cut logs, a mine entrance supported by timber frames, and various pieces of equipment scattered about. Everything spoke of careful work and limited resources. Victoria dismounted slowly, her legs unsteady, and walked toward the cabin. "Would you like me to wait out here?" Jacob asked softly. Victoria turned to look at him, this quiet man who had already done so much for her. "No, please come with me." The cabin door was not locked. Inside, everything was exactly as her father had left it. A narrow bed in one corner, a small stove, a table with a single chair. On the walls were pinned various maps and geological surveys, and on the table, as if waiting for her, was a letter with her name on it. Victoria's hands shook as she picked it up. The envelope was sealed, dated just 2 weeks before her father's death. She sank into the chair and carefully opened it, aware of Jacob standing quietly by the door, giving her space but remaining close enough if she needed him. The letter was written in her father's careful hand, and as Victoria read, tears began to stream down her face. "My dearest Victoria," her father had written. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and I am sorry for leaving you alone in this world. But I want you to know that these years in the Black Hills have been good ones. I have found something here, not just gold but purpose, a sense of contributing to something larger than myself. The claim is promising, truly promising. I believe with proper investment and work, it could provide handsomely for years to come. But more than that, I hope these hills might offer you what they have offered me, a chance to build something new, to be free of the constraints of our old life. You were always meant for bigger things than St. Louis society parties and safe, small choices. Your mother would have wanted you to be brave, to chase your own dreams. So if you decide to stay and work this claim, know that you have my blessing and my love. And if you decide to sell it and return to civilization, that is fine too. I only want you to be happy, my wild-hearted girl. The letter went on to give practical details about the claim, about the men in lead who could be trusted and those who could not, about the geology of the area and the best places to dig. But what mattered most to Victoria were those words, wild-hearted girl. Her father had always understood her in ways no one else ever had. He had known that beneath the proper manners and ladylike behavior she had been taught, there beat a heart that longed for something more, something fiercer and freer. When she finally looked up, Jacob was still there, still silent, but his eyes held understanding. She wiped at her tears and stood, folding the letter carefully. "He left me his dream," she said, her voice rough with emotion, "and I think I want to make it real." Jacob nodded slowly. "It will not be easy. Mining is hard work, expensive work. You will need men to help you, equipment, supplies. And even then, there are no guarantees." "I know," Victoria said, "but I did not come all this way to turn back now." Something shifted in Jacob's expression, a warmth that had not been there before. "Then I will help you if you want my help." "Why?" Victoria asked. "You barely know me." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, his storm-gray eyes searching her face. When he spoke, his whisper carried the weight of truth. "Because I knew your father and I owed him a debt. Because those men attacked you and that sits wrong with me. Because—" He paused, seeming to struggle with words. "Because I want to." It was perhaps the most he had said at once since they had met, and Victoria felt something warm unfurl in her chest. She had been alone for so long, carrying the weight of her grief and uncertainty by herself. The offer of help, given so simply and honestly, threatened to undo her completely. "Thank you," she managed. "I would be grateful for your help." They spent the rest of the afternoon examining the claim. Jacob moved through the mine entrance with a lantern, checking the stability of the supports and examining the rock face where Daniel Oakes had been working. He emerged dusty but satisfied. "He was onto something," Jacob said quietly. "See this." He showed Victoria a piece of rock with thin veins of what looked like gold running through it. "This is promising ore. Not rich enough to make you wealthy overnight, but with steady work and the right equipment, you could extract enough to make a good living." "What would I need?" Jacob considered. "At minimum, 2 or 3 experienced miners to help with the digging, better tools than what your father had, a way to process the ore once it is extracted. That means either partnering with one of the larger operations or investing in your own stamp mill, which would be expensive." Victoria's heart sank. "I have some money, but not nearly enough for all that." "There are options," Jacob said. "Some of the larger mining companies buy ore from independent miners. You could focus on extraction and let them handle processing. Or you could take on a partner, someone with capital who wants a stake in a promising claim." "Is the claim really that promising?" Jacob met her eyes directly. "Yes." "Your father did good work. He was methodical and smart about where he dug. With the right investment, this could be profitable." They walked back to the cabin as the sun began to set, painting the hills in shades of orange and purple. Victoria felt overwhelmed by everything she had learned, by the magnitude of the task ahead of her. But she also felt something else, a spark of excitement, of possibility. Her father had left her a legacy, and she was determined to honor it. "You should stay in town tonight," Jacob said as they reached the horses. "The cabin has not been lived in for weeks. It will need to be cleaned and restocked before you can move in." "Where would I stay?" "There is a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Patterson. She is honest and charges fair rates. I can take you there." Victoria hesitated. "And you, where will you stay?" "I have a room above the surveyor's office. It is not much, but it serves." They rode back to Lead as darkness fell, the lights of the town flickering like earthbound stars in the valley below. Mrs. Patterson's boarding house was exactly what Victoria had hoped for, clean and respectable, and the widow herself was a kind-faced woman who immediately took Victoria under her wing. "Of course you can stay here, dear," Mrs. Patterson said. "Your father was a good man. It is a tragedy what happened to him. That fever took 3 other men from the camps as well before it ran its course." Victoria had known her father died of fever, but hearing it confirmed made it real in a new way. He had not died violently or in some mining accident, but from illness, probably alone and possibly frightened. The thought made her chest ache. Jacob lingered in the doorway of the boarding house, and Mrs. Patterson gave him an approving look. "Jacob Emmett, I am glad to see you are looking after Miss Oakes. Not many men in this town I would trust with such a task." Jacob inclined his head silently, and Victoria realized with a start that she did not want him to leave. In just 2 days she had grown accustomed to his presence, to his quiet strength and unexpected kindness. "Will I see you tomorrow?" she asked, trying not to sound too eager. "Yes," Jacob whispered. "We should talk to some of the miners about hiring help for your claim. And I need to introduce you to Martin Sawyer. He runs the biggest assay office in Lead. He can test your ore and give you an honest evaluation." "All right. Thank you, Jacob, for everything." He looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his eyes. Then he touched the brim of his hat and disappeared into the night. Victoria lay in bed that night in a room that smelled of lavender and clean linen, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the frontier town settling for the night. She thought about her father, about Jacob Emmett, about the claim waiting for her up in the hills. She had come west expecting to quickly sell her inheritance and return to St. Louis, but now she found herself reconsidering. Maybe her father had been right. Maybe these hills did have something to offer her, something she had been searching for without knowing it. The next morning dawned bright and cold. Victoria dressed carefully in her most practical clothes and braided her hair tightly. Mrs. Patterson served a hearty breakfast of eggs and bacon, and by the time Victoria finished eating, Jacob was waiting outside with the horses. "We will start with Martin Sawyer," he said quietly as they rode through town. "Get your ore evaluated. Then we can make decisions about next steps." The assay office was a small building crammed with equipment Victoria did not recognize. Martin Sawyer himself was a thin man with spectacles and stained fingers, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent. "Jacob," he said in greeting, "I heard you brought Daniel Oakes's daughter to town." "My condolences, Miss Oakes. Your father was a good man and a careful miner." "Thank you," Victoria said. "Jacob suggested you might evaluate some ore samples from my claim." "Of course. Did you bring samples?" Jacob produced several rocks he had collected the day before, and Sawyer examined them with evident interest. He used various tools and chemicals Victoria did not understand, making notes as he worked. Finally, he looked up with a satisfied expression. "This is good ore, Miss Oakes. Not the richest I have seen from these hills, but solid and consistent. With proper extraction, I would estimate you could pull out $30 to $40 worth of gold per ton of rock. That is respectable. Victoria tried to calculate what that meant but found herself lost in the math. Jacob must have seen her confusion because he leaned close and whispered, "It means your claim is worth working. Not enough to make you rich quickly, but enough to make a living if you are smart about it." Relief washed through her. "So what should I do?" "You have options," Sawyer said. "You could sell the claim outright. I know several companies that might be interested. You would get a lump sum, probably between $2,000 and $3,000. That was more money than Victoria had ever possessed, but something in her rebelled at the idea of simply selling. It felt like betraying her father's memory, abandoning his dream for quick cash. "Or," she prompted, "or you could work it yourself. Hire miners, extract the ore, and sell it to one of the processing operations. That would be slower but potentially more profitable in the long run. Your father's claim is well situated and the geology is favorable." Victoria looked at Jacob, who had remained silent throughout this discussion. "What would you advise?" Jacob met her eyes, and she saw respect there, an acknowledgement that the decision was hers alone. "Depends on what you want." "Quick money and a return to St. Louis. Sell. A chance to build something here to make your own fortune. Work it." Put that way, the choice seemed obvious. Victoria had never been one to take the safe path, much to her mother's despair and her father's secret delight. She had not come all this way to turn coward now. "I want to work it," she said firmly. "I want to make my father's dream succeed." Sawyer nodded approvingly. "Then you will need help. I can recommend some miners who know their business and do not cheat their employers, and you will need equipment." "I can help with that," Jacob said quietly. "I know the territory and the men. I can make sure you get fair deals." Over the next 2 weeks, Victoria threw herself into preparing her father's claim for operation. With Jacob's help, she hired 3 experienced miners, honest men who had worked other claims in the area. She purchased better tools, timber for reinforcing the mine shaft, and supplies to make the cabin livable. Jacob was there every day, never intrusive but always present, offering advice in his whispered voice and handling negotiations with the various merchants and suppliers. Victoria found herself looking forward to seeing him each morning, to the way his face would soften slightly when he saw her, to the comfortable silences they shared as they worked. He never pushed her to talk, never demanded more than she wanted to give, but his steady presence became the anchor of her days. One afternoon, as they were reinforcing the entrance to the mine, Victoria realized she was happy. Despite the hard work and uncertainty, despite her grief for her father and the strangeness of her new life, she felt more alive than she had in years. Her hands were calloused and her dresses were permanently stained with dust, but she had purpose, direction, a sense of building something meaningful. "What are you smiling about?" Jacob asked softly, catching her expression. "I am just realizing that I like this," Victoria said. "The work, the challenge. I was so worried that I would hate it out here, that I would want to run back to civilization, but I do not. I love it." Jacob's answering smile was rare and beautiful, transforming his usually serious face. "The Black Hills get into your blood. I told you they had a way of healing wounds. Is that what happened to you? Did these hills heal you?" Jacob was quiet, his eyes distant. "Some, enough to keep living anyway." Victoria wanted to press, to understand more about this man who had become so important to her. But she had learned that Jacob shared himself slowly, in whispers and silences that revealed more than words. She would have to be patient. The mine began producing steady amounts of ore, nothing spectacular but enough to cover expenses and begin building a small profit. Victoria's 3 hired miners proved reliable, and word spread through Lead that the Oaks claim was well run and honest. Several other prospectors approached Victoria about partnerships or offered to buy her out, but she refused them all. This was her claim, her legacy, and she was determined to see it through. Jacob continued to help her, but Victoria noticed he was often absent on business of his own. When she asked about it, he was vague, mentioning scouting work for the larger mining companies and occasionally riding out to deal with claim jumpers or thieves. She gathered that his reputation as someone who could handle trouble made him valuable to the community, though he never boasted about it. One evening in late summer, nearly 2 months after Victoria had arrived in Lead, Jacob appeared at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house with a troubled expression. Victoria had been sitting on the porch with some mending, enjoying the cool air after a hot day at the mine. "Something wrong?" she asked immediately, setting aside her sewing. Jacob sat down beside her, and she noticed how carefully he chose his words. "There is talk that the Saunders gang is planning something big. They have been quiet since they attacked you, but the marshal has heard rumors they are gathering more men." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because your claim is isolated. If they decide to hit the smaller operations, you would be vulnerable." Fear fluttered in Victoria's chest. "What should I do?" "Move into town for a while. Keep your miners working during daylight but have them stay in Lead at night. Do not go up to the claim alone." "And what about you?" Victoria asked. "Will you be involved in stopping them?" Jacob was quiet for a long moment. "Marshall asked for my help. I know the hills better than most, and I can track them if needed." "Is it dangerous?" "Some, but it is necessary work." Victoria reached out without thinking and touched his hand where it rested on the porch railing. "Be careful, please." Jacob looked down at their hands, her small and pale against his tanned and work-roughened skin. He turned his palm up and threaded his fingers through hers, holding gently. The touch sent warmth racing through Victoria's entire body. "I will be careful," he whispered. "I have reason to come back now." They sat like that as the sun set, hands linked, not speaking but communicating something deeper than words. Victoria realized with a start that she had fallen in love with Jacob Emmett, this quiet man who had ridden into her life like smoke and changed everything. She did not know when it had happened, if it had been the first moment she saw him or gradually over weeks of working beside him, but the truth of it was undeniable. "Jacob," she said softly, "I need to tell you something." He turned to look at her, his gray eyes serious and attentive in the fading light. "I think I am falling in love with you," Victoria said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I know we have not known each other long, and I do not expect you to feel the same way, but I needed you to know before you ride off into danger. I needed you to know that someone would be waiting for you to come back." Jacob's expression did not change, but his hand tightened on hers. When he spoke, his whisper was so quiet she had to lean very close to hear. "I have loved you since the day I saw you on that trail, fighting to control your horse with bandits chasing you. You were terrified but brave, and I knew then that you were someone special. I did not say anything because I did not think someone like you would want someone like me. I am not educated or refined. I am just a scout who is more comfortable with horses than people." "You are the finest man I have ever known," Victoria said fiercely, "and I do not want refined or educated. I want real. I want you." Jacob lifted his free hand slowly, as if giving her time to pull away, and cupped her cheek. His palm was warm and calloused, and Victoria leaned into the touch. Then he kissed her, soft and careful, a whisper of a kiss that somehow conveyed everything his quiet nature kept hidden. Victoria kissed him back, pouring all her hope and fear and love into that moment of connection. When they finally pulled apart, Both of them were breathing hard. Jacob rested his forehead against hers, and Victoria could feel the rapid beat of his heart. "When this business with the gang is over," he whispered, "I want to court you properly. I want everyone in Lead to know you are mine if you will have me." "I will have you," Victoria said. "Today, tomorrow, for as long as you want me." "Forever then," Jacob said, and kissed her again. The next morning, Jacob rode out with Marshal Hendricks and a posse of men to track the Saunders gang. Victoria watched him go with her heart in her throat, terrified that she had finally found love only to lose it to violence. But she forced herself to focus on her work, riding up to the claim each day with her 3 miners and overseeing the extraction of ore. She did not allow herself to think about what might be happening in the hills, about bullets and blood and men who did not whisper. 3 days passed with no word. Victoria barely slept, jumping at every sound in the night. Mrs. Patterson tried to comfort her, but nothing helped except keeping busy. Victoria worked until her hands bled and her body ached, trying to exhaust herself enough that worry could not keep her awake. On the 4th day, Jacob returned. Victoria was at the claim when one of her miners called out that a rider was approaching. She looked up, shading her eyes against the sun, and saw the paint stallion moving up the trail. Her heart leaped into her throat and she ran, forgetting dignity or decorum, just needing to see for herself that he was whole and unharmed. Jacob dismounted as she reached him, and she threw herself into his arms. He caught her, holding tight, and she felt his body shake with what might have been laughter or relief or both. "I am all right," he whispered against her hair. "We caught them. There was some shooting, but no one on our side was hurt. The Saunders gang, 3 dead, 4 captured. They will stand trial in Deadwood. It is over." Victoria pulled back enough to look at his face, searching for injuries. There was a fresh cut on his cheek and bruises on his knuckles, but otherwise he seemed unharmed. She touched the cut gently. "You are hurt. Just a graze. Nothing serious." "Do not ever scare me like that again," Victoria said fiercely. Jacob smiled, really smiled, and it transformed his face into something beautiful. "I told you I had reason to come back." That night, after Victoria had returned to the boarding house and cleaned up from the day's work, Jacob appeared at the door with a bouquet of wildflowers. "Mrs. Patterson answered his knock and then called Victoria down with barely suppressed excitement. "Jacob," Victoria said, surprised by the flowers, "these are beautiful." "I said I wanted to court you properly," he whispered. "That means flowers and calling on you like a gentleman." Mrs. Patterson beamed at them both. "Well, I suppose you two can sit in the parlor for a while. I will be right in the kitchen if you need anything." They sat together on the worn sofa in Mrs. Patterson's parlor, and for the first time since they had met, Jacob talked. He told her about his childhood in Pennsylvania, about his family's small farm and his 2 younger sisters. He told her about the war, how he had lied about his age to enlist at 15, how he had seen things that still haunted him. He told her about coming home to find his family dead from typhoid and the farm lost to debt, about drifting west because there was nothing left to hold him in the east. Victoria listened, holding his hand, offering comfort through touch when words seemed inadequate. She understood now why he was so quiet, why he chose whispers over shouts. He had learned too young that the world was brutal and unpredictable, that the things you loved could be torn away in an instant. Silence was his armor, his way of protecting what little softness remained in him. "I am sorry you suffered so much," Victoria said when he finally fell quiet, "but I am grateful it brought you here, brought you to me." "I am grateful too," Jacob whispered. "You make me believe in good things again." They sat together until Mrs. Patterson discreetly announced it was getting late, and then Jacob walked Victoria to the foot of the stairs, kissed her softly, and whispered good night. Victoria floated up to her room feeling like she might burst with happiness. Over the following weeks, Jacob courted Victoria with the same quiet intensity he brought to everything. He brought her flowers and small gifts, rocks with interesting mineral formations, or a leather journal for recording her mining operations. He took her on rides through the hills, showing her hidden valleys and clear streams, places where the beauty of the landscape took her breath away. And every evening he would call on her at the boarding house, and they would sit in Mrs. Patterson's parlor and talk about everything and nothing. The town noticed, of course. Lead was too small for anything to remain secret for long. Victoria heard the whispers and speculation, but she did not care. Let them talk. She was happier than she had ever been in her life. Her claim continued to produce steady profits, and Victoria began to feel confident in her ability to make a success of her father's legacy. She hired a fourth miner and invested in better equipment. Martin Sawyer told her that word was spreading about the quality of her ore, and several larger operations had expressed interest in buying her output at premium rates. "You have done well," Sawyer said one afternoon when Victoria came to his office with samples. "Your father would be proud." "I hope so," Victoria said quietly. "I feel like I am finally understanding what he found out here, why he stayed. And will you stay? There has been talk that you might sell now that the claim is profitable." "No," Victoria said firmly. "I am staying. This is my home now." When she told Jacob what she had said, he pulled her close and kissed her forehead. "I am glad," he whispered. "I was afraid you might decide to go back east eventually." "Never," Victoria said. "Everything I want is here." As summer faded into autumn, the aspens in the hills turned gold and the air grew crisp with the promise of coming winter. Victoria knew that mining operations would slow during the coldest months, but she had planned carefully and saved enough to carry her through. She was no longer the uncertain woman who had arrived in Lead 4 months ago. She was a businesswoman, a mine owner, someone with roots and purpose. One evening in October, Jacob appeared at the boarding house with unusual formality. He was wearing his best clothes, and his hair was neatly tied back. Mrs. Patterson took one look at him and ushered Victoria into the parlor with an expression that suggested she knew what was coming. Jacob sat beside Victoria on the sofa, and she noticed his hands were shaking slightly. It was the only sign of nervousness in his otherwise calm demeanor. "Victoria," he said, his whisper soft as always but weighted with importance. "I need to ask you something." Her heart began to race. "Yes." Jacob reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside was a simple gold band with a small but beautifully cut diamond. "I am not wealthy," Jacob said quietly. "I cannot offer you luxury or an easy life, but I can promise to stand beside you, to protect you, to love you with everything I have. Will you marry me?" Tears sprang to Victoria's eyes. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." Jacob's face broke into the widest smile she had ever seen on him, and he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Then he kissed her, deep and passionate, and Victoria heard Mrs. Patterson cheering from somewhere in the house. They were married in early November in a simple ceremony at the small church in Lead. Marshal Hendricks gave Victoria away, and Mrs. Patterson and Martin Sawyer stood as witnesses. Victoria wore a dress of deep blue velvet that she had purchased from a dressmaker in Deadwood, and Jacob wore a new suit that made him look both handsome and slightly uncomfortable. The ceremony was short, conducted by a circuit preacher who traveled between the mining camps. But when Jacob took Victoria's hands and whispered his vows, promising to love and cherish her until death parted them, she felt the truth of it resonate in her bones. This quiet man was hers, and she was his, bound together by love and choice. After the ceremony, There was a celebration at the town hall. It seemed like half of Lead turned out to wish them well. Victoria danced with her new husband, laughing at his whispered protestations that he was a terrible dancer. He was not actually, moving with the same natural grace he brought to everything, but she loved that he pretended to be awkward just to make her smile. Late in the evening, Jacob led Victoria away from the celebration. They rode up to her claim, which would now be their home. Jacob had spent the last week fixing up the cabin, expanding it and making it more comfortable. There was a new bed, a proper stove, curtains on the windows. It was still rough by city standards, but it was theirs, and that made it beautiful. Jacob carried Victoria over the threshold and she laughed at the traditional gesture. He set her down gently in the middle of their new home, and for a moment they just looked at each other, both suddenly shy despite the months of courtship. "I love you," Victoria said softly. "My quiet horseman." "I love you," Jacob whispered back. "My wild heart." He kissed her then, and Victoria felt the last of her nervousness fade away. This was right, perfect, exactly where she was meant to be. Jacob was gentle and patient, whispering endearments as he slowly unlaced her dress, as he learned the landscape of her body with reverent hands. Victoria had been nervous about her wedding night, uncertain what to expect, but Jacob made her feel safe and cherished, as if she were something precious to be protected. Their lovemaking was slow and tender, full of whispered words and gentle touches. Jacob never rushed, never pushed, always making sure she was comfortable and wanted to continue. When they finally came together fully, Victoria felt a sense of completeness she had never known before, as if a piece of herself that had always been missing had finally clicked into place. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the new bed, Victoria's head on Jacob's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Are you happy?" Jacob whispered into the darkness. "Happier than I knew was possible," Victoria answered truthfully. "Are you?" "Yes, more than I can say." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, and Victoria dreamed of gold veins running through stone, of horses running free across the prairie, of a quiet voice that spoke volumes. Their first winter together was harsh but wonderful. The mine operations slowed as snow piled deep in the hills, but Victoria and Jacob used the time to plan for the spring. They pored over geological surveys, talked to other miners about the best techniques, and refined their operation. Jacob taught Victoria to read the land, to see the subtle signs that indicated where gold might be hiding. Victoria taught Jacob to keep better records, to think strategically about marketing their ore and building relationships with buyers. They made a good team, complementing each other's strengths. Victoria's education and business sense combined with Jacob's practical knowledge and reputation created something powerful. By the time spring arrived, they had contracts with 2 major processing operations and plans to expand their workforce. But more than the business success, Victoria treasured the quiet intimacy of their life together. She loved waking up beside Jacob each morning, loved the way he would whisper good morning and kiss her forehead. She loved working beside him during the day, the comfortable silences interspersed with soft conversation. She loved their evenings together, sometimes reading aloud to each other, sometimes just sitting by the fire and listening to the wind in the pines. Jacob was not a demonstrative man in public, but in private he was affectionate and attentive, always finding small ways to show his love. He would leave wildflowers on her pillow, or rub her sore shoulders after a long day, or simply hold her close and whisper how much she meant to him. Victoria had never felt so loved, so seen, so valued. In late spring, Victoria realized her monthly courses had not come. At first, She thought it was simply the stress of the mining operation or the physical demands of frontier life. But when another month passed with no change, she went to see the doctor in Deadwood. Dr. Miller was an older man who had seen everything the frontier could throw at him. He examined Victoria thoroughly and then gave her a gentle smile. "Congratulations, Mrs. Emmett. You are going to have a baby." Victoria sat in stunned silence for a moment, then felt a smile spreading across her face so wide it almost hurt. A baby. She and Jacob were going to have a baby. She rode back to Lead in a daze, her mind spinning with the news. How would Jacob react? They had never discussed children, though she had assumed they both wanted them eventually. But was it too soon? They had only been married 6 months. Was the cabin adequate for raising a child? There was so much to think about, to plan for. Jacob was at the mine when Victoria returned, overseeing the day's operations. She climbed down from her horse, and he must have seen something in her face because he immediately came over, concern evident in his eyes. "What is wrong? Are you all right?" "I am fine," Victoria said quickly. "Better than fine, actually. I need to talk to you." They walked away from the other miners, finding privacy behind the cabin. Jacob took her hands, his gray eyes searching her face. "You are scaring me," he whispered. "What is it?" "I am pregnant," Victoria said simply. "We are going to have a baby." Jacob went very still, his expression unreadable. For a moment Victoria worried that he was unhappy with the news, but then she saw tears gathering in his eyes. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Victoria asked, needing to hear him say it. Jacob pulled back just enough to look at her face, and his expression was more open and vulnerable than she had ever seen it. "I am terrified and thrilled and happier than I have any right to be. A family. I thought I would never have that again." They held each other for a long time, both crying happy tears, both overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was coming. A baby would change everything, would make them not just husband and wife but parents, would tie them to this place and each other in ways even marriage had not. "We need to expand the cabin," Jacob said eventually, his practical nature asserting itself. "And hire more help so you do not have to work so hard. You need to rest to take care of yourself." "I am pregnant, not dying," Victoria protested. "I can still work." "Not like you have been," Jacob said firmly. "I am not risking you or our baby. We will hire someone to help manage the day-to-day operations." Victoria wanted to argue but found she could not. The truth was, she was already exhausted most days, and the physical demands of running a mine would only become harder as her pregnancy progressed. Maybe Jacob was right. Over the next months, they prepared for the baby's arrival. Jacob expanded the cabin, adding a second room that would serve as a nursery. Victoria sewed tiny clothes and blankets, amazed at how small a newborn baby would be. Mrs. Patterson and the other women in Lead offered advice and support, sharing their own experiences and helping Victoria navigate this new territory. The mine continued to prosper. With the additional help they had hired, Victoria was able to step back from the most physically demanding work while still overseeing operations. Jacob was protective to the point of being overprotective, constantly worried about Victoria's health and safety. She found it both touching and occasionally frustrating, but she knew it came from a place of love and his fear of losing what they had built together. In early winter, as snow began to fall again on the Black Hills, Victoria went into labor. Jacob rode to fetch Dr. Miller from Deadwood, pushing their horses hard through the cold. Mrs. Patterson came to stay with Victoria, providing comfort and encouragement as the contractions grew stronger and closer together. The labor was long and difficult. For hours, Victoria struggled, exhausted and in pain, wondering if she would survive this ordeal. Jacob returned with the doctor and refused to leave her side, holding her hand and whispering encouragement. His quiet strength was what got her through the worst moments, his presence an anchor when she felt like she might be swept away by pain and fear. Finally, after nearly 20 hours of labor, Victoria gave birth to a son. The baby's first cry filled the cabin, and Victoria collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted but triumphant. Dr. Miller cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a soft blanket, then placed him in Victoria's arms. "He is perfect," the doctor said with a smile. "A healthy boy." Victoria looked down at her son's tiny red face, at his perfect little fingers and the shock of dark hair on his head, and felt her heart expand in ways she had not known were possible. This was her child, hers and Jacob's, a new life they had created together. Jacob knelt beside the bed, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his son. He reached out with one finger and gently stroked the baby's cheek. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "I am your father. I promise to protect you and love you and teach you to be a good man." "What should we name him?" Victoria asked softly. They had discussed names but never settled on anything definite. Now, looking at her son's face, Victoria knew exactly what felt right. "Daniel," she said. "After my father, Daniel Jacob Emmett." Jacob nodded, more tears falling. "Daniel." "That is perfect." Little Daniel proved to be a relatively easy baby, sleeping reasonably well and nursing eagerly. Victoria marveled at how quickly she adapted to motherhood, how instinctively she knew what her son needed. Jacob was equally smitten, spending every free moment holding his son or just watching him sleep. "I never knew I could love something this much," Jacob whispered one night as he rocked Daniel while Victoria rested. "It terrifies me how much I love him, how much I would do anything to keep him safe." "I know," Victoria said. "I feel the same way, and about you too. Sometimes I cannot believe this is my life, that I get to have you and Daniel and this home we have built." "We are blessed," Jacob agreed quietly. "More than we deserve." As Daniel grew, Victoria and Jacob settled into their new life as parents. The mine continued to do well, providing steady income that allowed them to build a more comfortable life. They expanded the cabin again, adding more rooms and better furniture. Jacob began teaching Victoria to shoot, insisting she needed to be able to protect herself and their son if he was ever away. Daniel was a curious, active child who seemed to inherit his father's quiet nature and his mother's determination. He learned to walk early and was soon toddling around the mining claim, fascinated by everything. Jacob made him a small wooden horse that Daniel dragged everywhere, and Victoria sewed him tiny versions of his father's clothes. When Daniel was 2 years old, Victoria discovered she was pregnant again. This time the news was less of a shock, though no less wonderful. She and Jacob had talked about wanting more children, about giving Daniel siblings so he would not grow up alone. Their daughter was born in spring, an easier birth than Daniel's had been. They named her Sarah, after Jacob's mother, and from the moment she entered the world, it was clear she had inherited her mother's wild heart. Sarah was louder than Daniel had been, more demanding, full of energy and spirit. "She is going to be a handful," Jacob whispered one night as he walked the floor with a fussing Sarah while Daniel slept peacefully in his small bed. "Just like her mother," Victoria said with a smile. Jacob returned the smile. "Exactly like her mother, and I love that." The years passed in a blur of happiness and hard work. The mine continued to produce, and Victoria and Jacob slowly built their stake into something substantial. They were not wealthy by the standards of the eastern cities, but they were comfortable, secure, able to provide well for their children and save for the future. Lead grew around them, transforming from a rough mining camp into a more established town. Schools were built, churches, proper streets. The Homestake mine became one of the largest gold producers in the Western Territories, and the wealth it generated brought civilization and order to the Black Hills. Victoria and Jacob became respected members of the community. Victoria served on the school board, while Jacob occasionally helped the marshal with particularly difficult cases. Their home was always open to friends, and they were known for their generosity and fairness in business dealings. Daniel grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved the mines and spent hours listening to his father explain geology and mineral extraction. Sarah was his opposite, wild and fearless, always getting into trouble and dragging her older brother along on adventures through the hills. When Daniel was 6 and Sarah was 4, Victoria gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl they named Matthew and Grace. The cabin, which had been expanded so many times it barely resembled the original structure, suddenly felt very full. Jacob joked that they would need to start mining out of their bedroom to make more space. Or we could build a proper house, Victoria suggested one evening as they sat on the porch watching their 4 children play in the yard. Something bigger, with enough rooms for everyone. Jacob considered this, his expression thoughtful. We could afford it now. The claim has produced well and we have savings. Where would you want to build here? Victoria said immediately. On our land. This is our home. I do not want to leave it. So they built a new house, a proper 2-story structure with 6 bedrooms and a large kitchen. It took most of a summer to complete, but when it was finished, Victoria stood in the front yard and felt a sense of accomplishment that rivaled anything she had achieved with the mine. This was theirs, built with their own hands and the fruits of their labor. The children thrived in the new house. Daniel got his own room, which he immediately filled with rock samples and mining equipment. Sarah shared a room with Grace, much to Daniel's relief, as Sarah's tendency to wake early and make noise had been driving him crazy. Matthew, the baby of the family, though he hated being called that, had his own space where he could play with his growing collection of wooden animals Jacob carved for him. As the children grew older, Victoria insisted they all receive proper educations. Daniel attended the school in Lead, proving to be an excellent student with a particular gift for mathematics and science. Sarah was less interested in academics, preferring to spend her time outdoors, but she learned to read and write well enough. The twins were still young but showed promise in different directions. Matthew artistic and gentle, Grace fierce and competitive. Jacob taught all the children to ride and shoot, to read the land and respect the power of nature. He took them camping in the hills, showing them the hidden valleys and clear streams he had once shown Victoria. Those trips became some of Victoria's favorite memories, sitting around a campfire with her family, listening to Jacob's quiet voice tell stories of the old days, of how he had met their mother and tamed her wild heart. "You did not tame anything," Victoria would protest, laughing. "You just gave me a reason to direct all that wildness somewhere useful." "Maybe," Jacob would whisper, his eyes warm with love, "but I like to think I helped calm the storms a little." When Daniel turned 15, he approached his parents with a serious expression that reminded Victoria painfully of her own father. "I want to learn the mining business properly," Daniel said. "Not just the technical side, but all of it, management, finances, marketing. I want to be able to take over the operation someday." Victoria and Jacob exchanged glances, both proud and a little sad that their eldest was growing up so fast. "If that is what you want," Jacob said quietly, "then we will teach you everything we know." So Daniel began working alongside his parents in earnest, learning every aspect of the operation. He proved to have a gift for the business, seeing opportunities and connections that neither Victoria nor Jacob had considered. Under his guidance, they expanded their operation, opening 2 new shafts and employing nearly 20 miners. Sarah, meanwhile, had no interest in mining. At 16, she announced she wanted to become a veterinarian, much to everyone's surprise. "Animals make more sense than people," Sarah declared. "And someone needs to take care of all the horses and cattle around here properly." There were no veterinary schools nearby, but Victoria arranged for Sarah to apprentice with an older veterinarian who traveled the mining camps. Sarah threw herself into the work with typical intensity, and within 2 years she was handling simple cases on her own. The twins grew as well, Matthew developing into a talented artist whose paintings of the Black Hills began to sell in the markets of Deadwood and even as far as Denver. Grace, true to her name and her mother's spirit, became interested in law and social reform, reading every book she could find on women's rights and justice. Victoria watched her children grow and flourish with immense pride. She and Jacob had built something lasting, not just a successful mining operation but a family, a legacy that would extend far beyond their own lives. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Jacob surprised Victoria by taking her back to the spot where they had first made camp together, where she had asked him why he spoke so quietly, and he had told her his philosophy about loud voices and trouble. 20 years, Jacob whispered as they sat beside a new campfire in that same sheltered spot. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like forever." "I would not change a single day of it," Victoria said, leaning against his shoulder. "Even the hard parts, the struggles. It all led us here." "Do you ever regret staying?" Jacob asked. "Choosing this life instead of going back to St. Louis?" Victoria turned to look at him, at the face she knew as well as her own, at the gray in his hair and the lines around his eyes that came from years of squinting at the sun. "Never," she said firmly. "This life with you in these hills raising our children, it has been everything I never knew I wanted. You did not tame my wild heart, Jacob. You set it free." Jacob smiled and pulled her close, kissing her with the same gentle intensity he had brought to their first kiss all those years ago. "I love you, Victoria Emmett. I will love you until my last breath and beyond. And I love you, my quiet horseman, always." They made love under the stars that night, 20 years married but still as passionate and connected as they had been as newlyweds. Afterward, lying wrapped in blankets with Jacob's arms around her, Victoria reflected on the incredible journey her life had taken. She had come to the Black Hills expecting to quickly settle her father's estate and return to civilization. Instead, she had found her true home, her true love, her true self. The years continued to pass, marked by both joy and sorrow. Marshal Hendricks passed away and Jacob was asked to take over as Marshal of Lead. He refused, preferring his work with the mines, but he agreed to serve as a deputy when needed. Mrs. Patterson grew old and eventually died peacefully in her sleep, leaving Victoria heartbroken at the loss of her friend and mentor. But there were joys, too. Daniel married a sweet young woman named Catherine, and they gave Victoria and Jacob their first grandchild, a boy they named Jacob Daniel. Sarah, despite declaring animals superior to people, fell in love with a rancher named Thomas and married him in a beautiful outdoor ceremony. Matthew's paintings began to gain recognition across the West, and Grace was accepted to law school in San Francisco, determined to become one of the first female lawyers in the country. Victoria and Jacob gradually stepped back from the day-to-day operations of the mine, as Daniel proved more than capable of running things. They spent their time traveling the Black Hills, visiting their children and grandchildren, and simply enjoying each other's company. Jacob's hair had gone completely gray, and Victoria's had streaks of silver running through it, but they were still healthy and active, still very much in love. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their home watching the sun set over the hills, Victoria reached for Jacob's hand. "Do you remember the first time you saw me?" she asked. "What you were thinking?" Jacob was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. When he spoke, his voice was still barely more than a whisper, but it carried clearly in the still evening air. "I was thinking that I had never seen anyone so beautiful or so brave. And I was thinking that if I could just save you from those bandits, if I could just make sure you were safe, maybe that would be enough. Maybe that would give my life some meaning." "And did it?" Victoria asked softly. "Give your life meaning?" Jacob turned to look at her, his gray eyes as intense now as they had been 25 years ago when he had first whispered his name to her on that dusty trail. "You gave me everything," he said. "Purpose, family, love. A reason to speak, even if only in whispers. A reason to wake up every morning grateful for another day. You did not just give my life meaning, Victoria. You gave me life itself." Victoria felt tears streaming down her face. "And you gave me freedom. You saw who I truly was, my wild heart and stubborn spirit, and you did not try to change me or tame me. You just loved me exactly as I was." "And I always will," Jacob whispered, "in this life and the next." They sat together as darkness fell, hands linked, watching the stars emerge one by one over the black hills. Around them stretched their land, their legacy, built from dreams and determination and love that whispered but never shouted. More years passed in contentment. Victoria and Jacob became grandparents many times over, their house always full during holidays with children and grandchildren of all ages. They watched with pride as Daniel made the Emmett Mining Company one of the most respected operations in the territory. They celebrated as Sarah's veterinary practice grew to serve ranches across 3 counties. They attended Matthew's gallery showings and read Grace's passionate articles about women's suffrage and workers' rights. On their 40th wedding anniversary, their entire family gathered for a celebration. There were nearly 30 people crowded into the house and spilling out into the yard, 3 generations of Emmets and the families they had married into. Victoria stood in the middle of it all, her hand in Jacob's, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Daniel stood to make a toast, his own children clustered around him. "To my parents," he said, his voice strong and carrying, "who taught us that true wealth is not measured in gold extracted from the ground, but in the love we give and receive. Who showed us that quiet strength is often more powerful than loud bravado. Who proved that 2 people from different worlds can build something beautiful together. Thank you for everything you have given us." The assembled family raised their glasses, voices blending in agreement. Victoria looked up at Jacob through happy tears and saw his own eyes were wet. "We did good," she whispered. "We did very good," Jacob agreed, his whisper audible only to her. "Better than I ever dreamed possible." As they grew older, Victoria and Jacob's health gradually declined, but they faced it together as they had faced everything. When Jacob's hands grew too stiff to carve, Victoria would read to him for hours, choosing adventure stories and poetry. When Victoria's eyes grew weak, Jacob would describe the view from their porch in whispered detail, painting word pictures of the hills they both loved so much. They were in their 70s when Jacob fell ill with pneumonia one harsh winter. Victoria nursed him frantically, bringing in doctors from as far as Rapid City, but the infection had settled deep in his lungs. The children gathered, knowing their father was failing, and the house filled with quiet grief. Victoria rarely left Jacob's bedside. She held his hand and whispered all the things they had built together, reminding him of their first meeting, their wedding, the births of their children. Jacob listened with his eyes closed, occasionally squeezing her hand to show he heard and understood. On a cold February morning, with snow falling softly outside and his family gathered around, Jacob opened his eyes one last time and looked at Victoria. She leaned close, knowing he had something to say. "My wild heart," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Thank you for loving me. For giving me a life worth living. I will wait for you. Somewhere beyond these hills I will wait." "I love you," Victoria said, tears streaming down her face. "I will love you forever." Jacob smiled, that rare, beautiful smile that had always transformed his serious face. Then he closed his eyes and was gone, as quietly as he had lived. Victoria felt like part of her soul had been torn away. For 43 years, Jacob had been her partner, her love, her anchor. She had never spent more than a few days apart from him since that first meeting on the trail. Now she would spend the rest of her life without him, and the prospect seemed unbearable. But she was not alone. Her children surrounded her with love and support, taking turns staying with her, making sure she ate and slept. Daniel handled all the funeral arrangements, organizing a service that drew people from across the territory. It seemed everyone had a story about Jacob Emmett, about his quiet competence, his fairness, his willingness to help those in need. They buried him on a hill overlooking their mine, with a view of the Black Hills stretching to the horizon. Victoria stood beside the grave long after everyone else had left, talking to him as she had always done. "I do not know how to do this without you," she whispered. "You were my compass, my North Star. How do I find my way now?" The wind rustled through the pines, and Victoria imagined she could hear Jacob's voice in it, telling her she was strong enough, that she always had been. She touched the gravestone one last time and walked back down the hill, her children waiting to support her. Victoria lived for 5 more years after Jacob's death. They were not easy years, but they were good ones. She spent time with her grandchildren, teaching them about their grandfather and the early days in Lead. She helped Daniel with the business, her mind still sharp despite her aging body. She traveled to San Francisco to see Grace argue a case in court, to Denver to see Matthew's paintings displayed in a prestigious gallery, to the ranch to help Sarah deliver a difficult foal. But mostly, she sat on the porch of the house she and Jacob had built, looking out at the hills they had both loved and remembered. She remembered the first time she had seen him, appearing like smoke across the prairie to save her. She remembered his whispered courtship, his gentle touches, the way he had loved her so completely. She remembered building their life together, stone by stone, day by day, whisper by whisper. On a warm spring evening, with the aspens turning gold and the air sweet with pine, Victoria fell asleep in her chair on the porch and did not wake up. Her daughter Sarah found her the next morning, peaceful and still, a slight smile on her face as if she had seen something wonderful in her final moments. They buried her beside Jacob, on that same hill overlooking the mine and the Black Hills beyond. Daniel carved new words into the shared gravestone. Jacob and Victoria Emmett. He spoke in whispers. She lived with a wild heart. Together they built a legacy of love. The Emmett Mining Company continued to operate for another 50 years, passed down through generations of the family. The house Victoria and Jacob built stood for over a century, eventually becoming a museum dedicated to the early days of Lead and the Black Hills gold rush. And the story of the quiet horseman who never spoke louder than a whisper and the brave woman whose wild heart he had cherished became part of the legends of the West, told and retold as an example of love that transcended differences and built something lasting. In the end, Jacob and Victoria Emmett's greatest legacy was not the gold they extracted from the hills or the business they built, but the love they shared and the family they raised. They had proven that true partnership was not about one person dominating or taming the other, but about two people choosing each other every day, supporting each other's strengths, and building something together that neither could have achieved alone. The Black Hills still stand, ancient and unchanging, bearing silent witness to all the stories played out beneath their peaks. And somewhere in those hills, if you listen carefully on a quiet evening, some say you can still hear a whisper on the wind, speaking words of love that echo through eternity.